You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple.
Welcome to Sweet Talk, all things maple. I'm your host, Aaron Whiteman, co-director of the Cornell Maple Program, recording today from the Cornell University campus. Joining me from Lake Placid is my colleague and director of the Eline Maple Research Forest, Adam Wild. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Aaron. It's great to be back in the studio after a busy summer. There's a hint of autumn in the air here in the Adirondacks. We actually had our first frost advisory this morning, so it's almost time to get back into the woods and start preparing for the next sugaring season.
Wow, that's hard to believe. But also, for you and I, Adam, it's also time to start the next round of maple workshops. I have quite a few evenings and weekends booked across the state, and in addition to that, Alicia and I are helping teach a forest farming class on campus this semester, so it's going to be a busy fall.
Yes, it will be a busy fall this year. And speaking of workshops, Aaron, can you tell our listeners about the special workshop you and Catherine are hosting in early September?
Yeah, sure, Adam. I'm glad you brought that up. So coming up soon, if it hasn't already happened by the time this episode airs, Maple Program food scientist Dr. Catherine Monserrate and I are hosting Cornell Maple Confections Academy. So this is a little bit like Maple Camp, but the content's going to be quite a bit different. It's a 3-day intensive training at the Cornell Food Venture Center, and it will introduce participants to large commercial-scale food production and new product development technology. So we have some of the top experts in the Northeast providing the instruction, and we're really excited to help build maple businesses and get more maple syrup into the marketplace.
Wow, that sounds like a valuable training because as we all know, there are always new things to learn in maple. Making syrup can be complicated, and our knowledge and technology keeps evolving. So for today's episode, we're going to spend some time answering questions from you, our listeners.
That's right. Today, we're going to reach into the mailbag and address some of the questions submitted by our Sweet Talk audience. So let's get right into it. What's our first question, Adam?
Well, Aaron, our first question comes from Landon. And Landon asks, as a small producer in Michigan, what would be the number one tip when scaling up to 1,000 taps?
That's a tough question because there are a lot of different things to consider. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is something that you often say, Adam, your mantra of more taps doesn't always mean more sap, but always means more work. So thinking about that, what's the condition of your current sap collection system? Are there improvements you could make there to get more sap versus expanding would be one question that would come to mind for me.
Yeah, I think another question that would really pop out to me is making sure that you have the market for that maple syrup if you're going from 100 taps to 1,000 taps or whatever that scale might be, that increase in growth, especially right now with our bulk syrup prices being a little bit lower, is what's your market? Are you going to be just doing bulk maple syrup or do you have a good, strong retail market that you can sell that syrup? Because that's really important to think about when you're going to be scaling up and looking at spending a lot of capital dollars for equipment to kind of grow your operation. And so that can be really important. And kind of being in that 1,000 tap area can be a tough market to be in as far as thinking about the economies of scale of all the equipment that you need, right, Aaron?
Yeah, you're definitely into that stage where you're a bit above hobby scale. So you're going to have to invest in some bigger equipment. But there is, like you said, that question of whether or not you're operating at an economy of scale where that's going to pay off. And just thinking about, you're going to be making 300 to 500 gallons of syrup potentially. That's a lot of syrup to move, but that's not a huge amount of cash flow. But the equipment there can cost a fair amount, a bigger RO, a bigger evaporator potentially, bigger sap storage tanks. So there's a lot to consider on the cost-benefit analysis end.
Once you've decided I've got a good market, I want to go to 1,000 taps, what are the capacities that you need to process the 1,000 taps, right? What are some of the equipment things that stick out to you, Aaron?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I would go linearly through the process. You add those extra taps. Where does the sap go first? It goes into sap storage tanks. So make sure you have 2 gallons per tap so that you can comfortably accommodate big sap flows without scrambling in the middle of the night. Next would be reverse osmosis. Just project out how much sap you think you will get in any 12 to 24 hour period. Look at the capacity of your RO and say, okay, can my RO keep up with this? And same with the evaporator. So that's the way I would approach it. And definitely just, I guess to kind of summarize all these points, the first thing to think about is what are production goals? Are there other ways to reach production goals without adding taps by tightening up the system? If the system does need more taps to reach those production goals, will my system handle it as is? If not, what will I need to add and what will that cost? And then lastly, if it's not a vacuum system already, consider adding vacuum. But if you add vacuum, you're going to want to think about monitors.
Yeah, that adds a whole level. So that is one piece. If you're scaling up to 1,000 taps, my guess is you're probably smaller and you may even be on buckets. So that adds a whole new level of putting tubing into your woods and then potentially adding vacuum. And those monitoring systems really tend to pay off for themselves. That's the number one thing we hear from a lot of larger producers. Their biggest piece of advice or technology is the sensor systems that allows them to be efficient in keeping their vacuum up, which allows you to get production. So that goes back to that mantra of more taps doesn't always mean more sap. So if you can maybe keep your tap number smaller, but keep good production, and the vacuum and monitoring systems can help with that.
Yeah, and those monitors are also helpful in other ways as you scale up. You can add the tank sensors and things like that. It just helps you keep track of the whole operation, which is going to be bigger at 1,000 taps. So there's going to be more work, and the monitors really help with that aspect.
I think another thing to also think about of scaling up to 1,000 taps is what is the end goal? I think a lot of producers will tell you, and I know people ask a lot of times, like, what size sugar house should I build? And everybody says build it 2 or 3 times larger than what you think you'll need, because inevitably you grow more in the future. So is 1,000 taps, is that definitely going to be the hard stop? Or do you think that you're going to be going even larger? And so think about that more longer term goal and planning. And so even though it might cost a little bit more money up front, but you might be better trying to get a tank or RO that can handle 2,000 taps if you're going to eventually be to that size as well.
Yeah, definitely lots to consider. I think it's curious, Adam, we never get questions about downsizing, do we? It's always about upsizing. I think everybody's always looking to grow. So probably check out the forums too and see what people are saying on MapleTrader and just see what other people's experiences are. Scaling up might be a good idea.
Definitely, for sure. And I think at that size, it's typically more economical to think about used equipment sometimes for certain things. It depends on what exactly the different type of machine that you're looking for. But again, going to that economies of scale, that you really need to think about your expenses, because it can be a tough area to be in. Generally, we don't see some of the larger commercial maple operations being more profitable till they get more to 3,000 to 5,000 taps. Some of the work that Mark Canella has done from the University of Vermont, looking at some of the benchmarking with maple operations. But that really depends on your market, though. And so if you're doing a lot of value added or you have some niche market, maybe you can be okay.
So I hope that answers your question, Landon. And if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to us and we'll give you more specifics. Moving on here to our next question, received through Spotify from someone whose handle is Doc Maple. The question is, when will isopropyl alcohol be approved in the U.S.? Oh, that's a question that we get a lot, and I wish we had an answer. What's the latest, Adam? What have you heard?
Yeah, that is a very common question. I think we all wish that it could just get approved, but unfortunately, it's a complicated one. And so to have approval in the U.S., it needs to get manufacturer approval through the EPA, which unfortunately is kind of a cost prohibitive process to go through at this point, and that we can't just have the universities or the Maple Associations just kind of push through and get the approval. That it actually needs to come from the manufacturers of isopropyl alcohol, need to go through that process to get the approval through the EPA, and they need data and things like that for that approval. But unfortunately, it just costs a lot of money. And the Maple Associations, the IMSI, have reached out to different manufacturers to try to see if they have interest in going through that process. And unfortunately, a lot of them just don't see a benefit of them spending that money at this time.
Yeah, this is really a safety question. And so there isn't a workaround for this. When we're recommending using chemicals at large scale, especially in food safe applications, it really needs to go through all the wickets and the EPA approval process. I've looked at the manual for submitting something for approval, and it has like 24 chapters, just the application manual itself. So it's complicated, it's expensive. So I'm not holding my breath. It doesn't look like any manufacturer is willing to take this up right now in the United States. But, the caveat there is that isopropyl alcohol, or IPA, as a lot of people refer to it as, it's just not a magic bullet. It works. It has certain attributes that are different than other sanitizers, like that you can seal it inside the system during the summer and it just kind of evaporates and recondenses and sanitizes the whole system to some degree. But its effectiveness has limits too. And it takes a lot of work. If you look at the isopropyl alcohol sanitizing guidebook, I think it's from Center Acer, there are a lot of steps. It takes a lot of trips to the woods. So it's not a magic bullet. And there are other sanitizers that we can use in the same way that are labeled for use in the US that are pretty darn effective. And one that comes to the top of my mind is calcium bleach or calcium hypochlorite, which works really well. I don't know. Have you tried calcium hypochlorite, Adam?
I've used it for some mainline cleaning. I haven't used it on spouts and laterals, but we've been cleaning our main lines with it at the end of every season. And even that alone takes some time. It is some work to flush it down through. And that's not even doing all the lateral lines.
Yeah, it definitely takes some work. But the advantage I've found, and I've used this quite a lot now, the calcium hypochlorite with pretty good effectiveness, is that there's a label approved use. So there's instructions on the label for sanitizing porous food surfaces. And it's important to emphasize that maple tubing is considered a porous surface. Now, pores, that doesn't mean it has holes in it that the sap can go right through. It just means that there are crevices within the material itself where the chemicals or microbes can get caught up in the matrix of the plastic. So it has to be treated as that porous plastic. And if you look at the instructions for food grade calcium hypochlorite, it will have instructions for how to sanitize a porous food surface. So it's really helpful to have those instructions. And when I've used it according to the label in the woods, it seems to be pretty darn effective at keeping the tubing clean and productive in the following season.
You're not using that for sterilizing spouts at this point, right, Aaron? You're just using it for drop lines, laterals, main lines?
Right. We haven't used the SteriCap. And I guess that's the one disadvantage of bleach is that you can't let it sit for long term and just leave it in the woods. There's a contact time that's permissible. And the bleach breaks down fairly quickly anyway, so you end up with just water in the lines. If you leave it for a long period of time, or if you put a SteriCap on a spout, the bleach would get neutralized, then you would just have another liquid medium to grow new microbes. So we're not sterilizing spouts. What we have done is we've sucked it through our lateral lines and then also washed our main lines with it. So it was like not quite an intensive sterilization of our lateral lines, but it was a way to use a sterile solution to push the sap and sugar residue out of the lines. And then for the main lines, we've used a 2-step treatment process with that, and they seem to come really clean. So, I'm not to ramble too long about calcium hypochlorite, but in terms of should we sit around crying, waiting for isopropyl alcohol, I don't think we need to do that. We have other chemistry that works right now.
I think the important thing is just to remind listeners to make sure you use something that is approved in the U.S. I know, unfortunately, there are people in the U.S. who sometimes use isopropyl alcohol, and that should not be used. That's not safe to use at this point in time, and your syrup could potentially get pulled and discarded from the shelf or from your barrels if you are using it. So don't do that at this point. The IMSI does continue to look into maybe there are some other workarounds, some avenues, so maybe there is some potential in the future, but at this point, unfortunately, we have to hold off.
Yep, I agree.
So our next question comes from Amy, and Amy asks, can tapping trees too early in the season affect their sap production? That's a great question, Aaron. That's one I think that's been on people's minds, especially the last couple of years when we've had kind of these warmer winters, these thaws in early January. So what's your take on tapping trees too early in the season? How's that affect the total sap production across the season?
Well, this is a topic you and I have been looking into quite a lot with our total dormant season sap study. So we've been tapping trees as soon as they become dormant in October and then retapping them through the spring to try to learn a little bit more about the sap sugar content and the sap production volume. But there really aren't any strong conclusions to draw from that about how early tapping and then retapping affects sugar content during the sugaring season. But the really relevant facts that we've learned are, first of all, just retapping is just not all that feasible. I think a lot of people have looked at that many times. The extra wound formation in a tree, the wounded wood formation, and the time it takes kind of eliminates that as a feasible option, except in very specific circumstances. So that kind of leaves us back at square one with the calculus that we've always used to figure out when to tap. And that's the fact that tap holes have a limited lifespan. So you have to figure out when to tap early enough to catch those early big runs, but not so early that your tap holes start drying up toward the end of the season when we traditionally have the biggest runs right before it turns buddy. So that's kind of where I'm at with it, is just we're back to the traditional thinking of, okay, how early can I get away with tapping without losing production before the big runs of the sap season end? But on top of that, there are some other considerations about sanitation, right, Adam?
Yeah, exactly. I think what's really even more important now is this tap hole sanitation that we need to think about, especially with these earlier thaws. And if we want to be tapping these trees sooner, from some research that we've done up at the Eline Forest of finding that, generally, as long as, your tubing is newer, or clean, you can tap kind of sooner, but it's fine generally as long as it stays cold. But when we get these little runs and it starts flowing early, that's when we start to get that microbial growth. As soon as it warms up in those tap holes, the microbes start growing and plugging up the cells of the wood. And so that tap hole sanitation is really important. And so when we're talking about tap hole sanitation, it goes back to that, either having a new spout or a spout that's been sterilized, the drop lines are newer or have been sanitized, so that there's less chance of microbes getting back into that tap hole. And so those are really, really important. But I think what we're finding is, tapping a little bit sooner is generally paying off, especially when we have these early thaws. We can no longer wait till middle of March to tap our trees or early March. We probably need to be starting in late January, maybe even early January, depending on the location of where you are. That's the big thing, is it depends on where you're located. But tapping a little early is probably better, but not extremely early. Tapping in November may not be the best option.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment, Adam. It seems like most years, if you have your spouts in the tree by the beginning of February, you're going to do okay. There are years where if you don't, you're going to miss out. This past season, producers in Western New York, if they didn't have their trees tapped at the beginning of February, they really missed out on the season because it was over by the first week of March. So I guess you never know. It has to be part of the answer. Your tap holes can be nice and fresh and you can have nice clean tubing. And if we have 3 days of 70-degree temperatures at the end of January, that could really impact your system. And you never know these days. That could happen. So it's not a guarantee, but it seems like if you get your spouts out there fairly early, beginning of February, that you're most likely going to catch all the runs. And I think that's really probably the most specific guidance we can provide at this point. Keep your system clean, do all the tap hole sanitation practices. If you haven't heard about tap hole sanitation, do a little search and see what's been published in the Maple News and elsewhere about what people are doing to keep their tap holes productive over time. Contact us if you have questions, and then just try to have your taps in the tree by early February, late January, and you should hopefully be okay, barring unforeseen circumstances, which are always possible with the weather.
Yeah, it depends on the number of taps, but, sometimes just looking at what's the weather report. I mean, it's tough to predict, but if you can look that, this coming week, it's going to be great sap flow, then it may be worth going out there and tapping those trees if you think they're ready. And some of that's going to depend on, your lifestyle. Are you ready for tapping the trees or not as well? One thing I think some sugar makers are kind of being put up against is, do they want to be tapping in December and be making syrup on Christmas? And there's a lot of sugar makers that are starting to do that now. If we get sap runs around Christmas time, if you're a larger operation, do you have the staff to be able to do that? And it is a tough one that I don't think we've had to deal with in the past, but many producers are starting to face that, especially in the warmer regions, more southern New York, parts of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio. You can easily get decent runs in December, and it may not be too early to tap those trees.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. And thanks, Amy, for that question. Very relevant. And I would say just keep track of the wisdom as it evolves on this topic, because conditions are changing and we're learning more. And on sort of a related topic, we have a question from Anthony about the end of the season maple cleaning. His question is, there's a paucity of guidance for end of season care. He notes that the last publication he saw was 10 years ago, and that it recommended definitely discard the old tap, replace drop line in the fall with a new tap. Looking for an expert opinion on what's new, I guess, and the end of season guidance. And yeah, Adam, I think this is a great question because it's an area where there definitely is a lack of clear guidance right now.
Yeah, we probably do need to do a little more work on providing some new guidance on that, but it depends. There is some information that is out there. And there's many different methods. I think the biggest thing is making sure get the spouts pulled from the trees as soon as you can. Get the tubing line drained out as quickly and as best that you can. First, kind of answering that question about discarding the old tap. Generally, at least in the US where we aren't using isopropyl alcohol to sanitize our spouts, it is recommended to replace new spouts every year, or if you can get them sanitize your spouts. People have different methods. Some producers, like I like to cut the tap off when I'm pulling at the end of the year, cap off the dry line, and then put on new spouts either before I tap or when I'm out tapping. Whereas other people, I think you, Aaron, you leave the spouts on and you pull them off when you're putting on new ones when you're going out to tap or getting ready to tap, right? So that depends. Drop lines don't have to be replaced every year. Generally, the guidance is every 3 years, unless you can do cleaning on those drop lines. Do you replace drop lines every few years, Aaron?
Our methods have been changing a little bit. Like you mentioned a minute ago, whether or not we cut the spouts off, that actually depends on the style of tee we end up buying. If we have a tee with a post for the tubing, we cut the spout off. If it just has a cup, we leave the spout on because we're untapping under vacuum, which is a practice I definitely recommend. If you have vacuum, to just leave the vacuum pump on, untap the last spout on your lateral line first and leave it dangling as you untap the other spouts. That will really help you suck all the sap out of the line. And then with our drop lines, we were replacing them every 3 years, but now we've been sanitizing some of them instead. So we kind of do a hodgepodge, but I guess to simplify this for our listeners, there are 3 main points. Get your trees untapped as soon as possible would be the biggest one. As you mentioned earlier, there's so many times I've been driving around in June or July even, and you see taps still in trees in the sugar bush. And that's not good for the trees, and it's definitely not good for your tubing. If you can get that untapped and get the sap out of there, that would be the second point. Get it drained, get it untapped and get the sap out of your lines as soon as possible. Then you're going to have much less growth of microbes and things that are going to scum up your tubing. And then the last thing, get it untapped, get it drained, and then clean it if you can. And I know cleaning, that's the big one that everyone wonders about, is how to clean their tubing. We touched on this a little bit in our last question. It's tough. There's not one standard method that works really well. None of it is easy, but if you can clean your tubing and get the cleaning chemicals rinsed and drained and get it dry, you're going to have a much better looking system when you start in the fall, and you're just going to get better yields. To some extent, when you get that first sap run that freezes and then thaws, that's going to scour your lines clean to some degree. And you should always definitely let your first sap run go on the ground. But in terms of like solid, this is how you do it guidance, we just don't have that out there right now.
Yeah, I think part of that is because, it's an evolving industry and the methods do evolve a little bit, right? So, if you do have specific questions, certainly reach out to us. Look on mapleresearch.org or other experts or other producers, see what they're doing. I would agree with what you said, Aaron, about untapping your trees with vacuum on. If you do have vacuum, that really helps to get the lines clean.
Yeah, and I will add just one layer of complexity to the answer to this question. We're currently testing at the Arnott Forest ways to sanitize while untapping. So for the past 2 years, as we've untapped our sugar bush, for each spout as we pull it, we actually inject an ounce of calcium hypochlorite sanitizing solution through the lines. And we only do 200 parts per million is what we've been trying. So it's not enough to actually sanitize the lines, but it's a sanitary solution that will rinse some of the mold and yeast and things that grow in the lines out of the system and also get the sugar out. And it seems to be pretty effective. And then we follow that up with a mainline cleaning where we use 200 parts per million, followed by 600 parts per million, followed by a 200 parts per million rinse. And we're trying to just suck all that through the system. But the reason I'm saying it adds some complexity is we really haven't figured out how to do this in an optimal way yet. Carrying around all that sanitizing solution in the woods takes a lot of work, takes a lot of time. And the other thing is, the methodology needs to be tweaked a little bit. So for example, we started by untapping our laterals and then sanitizing our main lines. But what we notice is, because we're doing this all under vacuum, is when we sanitize the main lines, some of that sanitizer shoots up into the lateral lines as it passes through the system. So maybe it would make more sense for us to sanitize our main lines, sanitize laterals, and then go through with a final rinse of the main line. So those are the little nuances we're still trying to figure out. But it is possible to sanitize your system as you untap. So if you're willing to do the extra work, that's also an option out there. And we found that it makes our system really much better when we come around and tap the following fall, that we get really good sap right off the bat. we still discard that first sap run, but it's coming through clean and fresh. So there are options out there. Stay tuned for that. But I guess the long story short here, the one thing I would recommend is get started early and get your system clean. Don't get complacent. Don't let your end of the season laziness, which we all experience, right, set in, and just get out there and untap the trees and get the system cleaned as soon as you're done making syrup.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Making sure that your tubing is laid out well, that you don't have lots of dips and sags. If you've got some low spots, you're not going to get all that sap out of the lines, and that's just going to sit there.
Yeah, and lay it out so that it's accessible for cleaning if possible. That also helps.
Yeah, exactly. When we install new main lines or some of our old main lines, we've gone and added valves at the end of all of the main lines so that we can, access to open those and shoot cleaning solution down through.
Yep, and get those main lines, the end of the main lines out close to roads if you can, even if it means adding a little extra tubing. It will save you a lot of work lugging buckets through the woods or whatever. If you have a road, you can just drive up in your ATV or truck or tractor or whatever and sanitize right from the tractor. That's very handy.
Definitely, I would 100% agree with you on that, Aaron. So along that, same line, thinking about cleaning, but thinking maybe without vacuum, is a question that we have from James on the topic of 3/16 inch tubing best practices. So in a 3/16 gravity system, James says he's going in and replacing both the spout and T each season. Is this still a recommended practice? So that's a great follow-up question, Aaron, right? 3/16 tubing, the smaller size, that's more likely to clog. We've found over time that generally after 2 to 3 seasons that the smaller diameter tubing, especially at the fittings that are even smaller than 3/16, have a tendency for microbes to build up and clog the tubing, so that restricts the flow in following seasons. So what are kind of the best practices out there that are recommended for 3/16 cleaning, Aaron?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something we've looked at quite a lot. And just as background for folks who haven't had experience or don't know about 3/16 inch tubing, of course, the standard size for maple tubing for the lateral lines is 5/16 of an inch, which has been used successfully for a lot of years. About, I think, 15 years ago now, there was some work done looking at 3/16 diameter tubing. And what they found was if you install this smaller diameter tubing on a good slope, that when the sap fills the tube, it fills the tube all the way and creates kind of like head pressure. So as the sap moves downhill, it creates a vacuum behind it. And you could essentially get a natural vacuum without a vacuum pump, which could sometimes even double your yields. And it was a great discovery that I think a lot of people have experiences with areas of the woods that they would love to tap and put on vacuum, but they can't get vacuum out there for whatever reason. They don't have electricity on site, or it's just a hard place to reach. And 3/16 solves that problem. You get really great yields. So a lot of people went and put that tubing in the woods, only to discover that after 2 or 3 seasons, the yields start to drop dramatically in a lot of cases. And that's caused by biofilm buildup in these fittings, as Adam mentioned. So we've looked at that for quite a while, ways to resolve that issue. And as James points out, one option is just cutting out the T, the whole drop line, because those fittings are really where the plugging was occurring. And that's what we found in the woods when we cut our system apart, is the T's, especially lower down on the lateral line, would just clog with biofilm. So that's definitely one way you can get around that, is replace your drop and your T and your spout every year. That's a bit wasteful from some perspectives. You're going to have to throw away all that plastic that you just purchased, and it's a lot of work. So one alternative we've tested is sanitizing 3/16 inch lines using calcium hypochlorite, injecting it into the lateral lines, either with a pump or with a backpack sprayer or something like that, letting it sit for several minutes of contact time, and then draining and rinsing it. And that seems to also be effective. So James, if you're looking for an alternative to cutting out the drops, you can sanitize your system. This might even be a little bit more work, but you're not wasting a lot of materials, and it sanitizes the whole line and seems to maintain production. That would be my main recommendation. I know some people that are on steeper slopes are having less problems than people that are on more gentle slopes, but it seems like there's something that still should be done every year to keep those productive. And then, as you mentioned, replacing components or sanitizing are really the two options. Am I missing anything, Adam?
I think those are the key points, Aaron. The biggest thing I'll, just point out is that, pay attention to the flow, especially the last third or quarter of your season, and decide, do you need to replace something? So there's some research that you and Steve Childs at the Arnott found that, replacing the T-fittings did increase flow on older tubing the following season, but it hasn't really been tested of, do you do that every year? Do you do it every 2 years, 3 years? So, and that probably is going to depend on each season, how warm it was, how much microbial growth you had, how dirty the tubing might be. So it's probably important just watch the tubing flow at that later part of the season, and you should see if it's slowing down. When we had a bunch of 3/16 tubing in our woods, there was one season I just remember like walking through this one section that had 3/16, and it's like you're looking at the lines and like it should be a good sap flow day. I know in all the areas where I had 5/16 I had good flow, but in those areas with 3/16 it's like hardly moving. And so that was a good sign that either that lines needed to be cleaned or those fittings needed to be replaced because they were clogged up. So just pay attention, and if you're getting good flow even at the end of the season, most likely it's going to be fine next year. You can come back in a month or two after you've pulled your taps and you'll look and it may be perfectly fine because that biofilm, that microbes will dry up and you'll think it'll be okay. So you want to pay attention when it's flowing because once it dries up, it'll look fine, but the following year that can rehydrate and will clog up again. So pay attention to the flow rate in your tubing.
Yeah, I'll never forget the first time I had some of these realizations about 3/16 tubing when we first put it in the woods. Everything seemed to be flowing in a lot of parts of the woods. Then I went to the 3/16 tubing and it wasn't moving at all in the lines. And this was at a point where we were still thinking that the fall off in production of 3/16 was due to sap getting sucked back into the tap hole. And, I walked up my lateral line and I pulled a spout out of the tree. And instead of getting vacuum sucking that sap down the line, the sap just came dribbling out the spout. And that's when I realized I had a clog. So it's definitely really noticeable. If you pay attention, you can quickly figure out what's going on and then address the issue. Moving on to a totally different topic, we received multiple questions over the past few months about accessing printed copies of our reference books. So the answer to all these questions is we do have a lot of printed materials on our website, especially the Cornell Maple Program Notebook Series, which includes our vacuum tubing notebook, our confections notebook, our beginner's notebook, our sugar bush management notebook, and a few others that we're in the process of revising. But we do not sell printed copies of those. They're available for free download. You can go to our website and find them, and you're welcome to do whatever you want with them. You can download them for your own personal use. You can take it to a print shop or use your own printer and have printed copies made. You can even print them out and sell them. We don't hold a copyright that we enforce, but we just do not have the capacity to print these out and mail them. It just takes an incredible amount of time and we have other work that we have to focus on. So if you have trouble finding the resources on our website, please, by all means, contact us and we can help send you a link. But except for in very specific circumstances, we're just not able to print those out and make them available in hard copy format. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Adam?
One piece I want to add is that we do continue to update these notebooks. And so that's another reason why we don't always print them out, because we might go and update them a year later and then that old one's kind of out of date.
Yeah. And I sympathize with folks that want a hard copy. I have all these notebooks downloaded on my iPad where I can use my stylus to take notes on them and everything. But even that isn't as handy as having the hard copy. And I especially sympathize with our Amish friends who don't have access to a computer or other folks that don't have access to a computer. But really, this is the only way that we can make these available and keep them updated. So I just encourage you to go online and find the notebooks, even if you have an old copy of our confections notebook, for example, and just check and see what the latest version looks like and go through the steps to get it printed out if you want a printed copy. Most of these are only a few hundred pages. Even most small towns have a print shop that can print it out for you at a pretty reasonable cost, probably less than we would have to charge to print it and mail it to you.
Yeah, definitely. So moving on to our next question on the subject of shelf life of maple sugar, the maple sugar, not the maple syrup. So I have an unopened container of maple sugar and wondered what the shelf life of that product might be. I understand it is considered shelf stable, but wanted to seek your advice on this point. So what do you think, Aaron? What's the kind of recommendation that you provide folks on shelf life of maple sugar?
Yeah, granulated sugars in general are quite stable, but maple sugar does have some moisture content in it. It's not like table sugar, like cane sugar. It's really more like brown sugar. So it behaves much like that way when you're thinking about shelf life. So the shelf life is indefinite. But there are a few different things that can affect the quality of the sugar. And one is that the flavor is going to diminish over time. Some of the flavors that are in maple syrup are unstable or volatile. So if it continues to dry, you could lose some of the flavors. The volatiles could evaporate off of it. And some might change over time too, just due to physical changes in the sugar. So your optimal flavor characteristics are really when maple sugar is fresh. And then over time, they can dissipate. And also, much like brown sugar, the physical properties can deteriorate. I'm sure a lot of folks have the experience of opening a bag of brown sugar and then maybe just kind of twisting it closed and putting a clothespin on it or a rubber band, but it's not fully sealed. And then it starts to get wet and clumpy in there. And maple sugar can do the same thing. So it's really important to keep it sealed in an airtight container. And if you can, remove the air before resealing if possible. And if you do that, your sugar should stay fresh and usable for a long time. But regardless of how it looks, it is considered usable indefinitely. It doesn't really have a shelf life.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's just the flavor can certainly diminish some over time. That's the biggest piece. And that airtightness is really important. And it depends on some sugar tends to have a little bit moisture than others. Kind of depends on the amount of invert sugar that you have in the syrup that you're making or turning into that sugar.
Yeah, and if you're interested in improving the shelf life of your own sugar, I highly recommend that you go to our confections notebook that we just referenced in the last question and just pull up the chapter on granulated sugar, and there are recommendations there on moisture content, how to achieve the right moisture content through drying of the sugar, which is sometimes necessary, and what packaging solutions are ideal for enhancing shelf life. So definitely check that information out. So we have another question about value-added products, and this is a question from Stephanie about maple jelly. Her question is, "Hi there, I would like to make a maple jelly, and I have a winning recipe. My concern is food safety and proper canning so that it's safe. Is there someone I can speak to?" When we're getting back into these questions of food safety, it's really important to comply with the law. As some of our listeners may know, if they've made canned goods before, something like a jelly is preserved by being hot packed and being acidified. So if you don't get the right acid level, it can be pretty dangerous. You can get botulism in your food, and that can actually be deadly. So it's really critical to follow the guidelines exactly. But fortunately, there's a lot of guidance out there for complying with food safety regulations about something like this product. Adam, what are some of the places people can look?
So, we're certainly happy to take questions like this. Our food scientist, Dr. Catherine Monserrate, who is happy to, to point towards resources and help answer these questions. So that's one great resource is to reach out to us or reach out to Catherine. Another one is your state agri markets that you have that generally can answer those questions. We also, in New York State, we have the Cornell Food Venture Center, and they can generally answer questions from folks in other states as well. So reaching out to your state process authority, which in New York is our Cornell Food Venture Center. And generally, to have something that you can market, you're going to need a scheduled process approval for this. So you're going to have to go through that process authority. So that's generally a great resource to reach out to.
And for folks that are kind of new to the value-added world, looking at things beyond the traditional maple confections, I really encourage you to look more into this and into the food safety rules and definitely find out, depending on what state you're in, who the process authorities are. Because your process authority is the person that's going to evaluate your recipe and your process for food safety. And they're usually very helpful for answering questions. If you don't know who your process authority is in your state or how to find one, your cooperative extension is often helpful in identifying that person and getting in contact with them. So look into the process approvals and learn more about this. It's definitely something that you need to take it seriously.
Anytime you're adding something to maple, you're most likely going to need like a certified kitchen to do that in. And so reaching out to that process approval is going to be required anyway. So you might as well just reach out. But each state, each province is going to have different regulations, exemptions. So it's important to check for the area that you're living in.
Yeah, and I'll just add that for some types of food, there are additional trainings and certifications that you need to produce them. So be prepared for that possibility as well. And one last thing I'll say is that if you're not getting the information you need or not able to find a process authority, you can always reach out to your food inspectors. They can sometimes be very helpful. In New York State, that's through the Department of Agriculture and Markets. In other states, sometimes it's the Department of Health. But every state has food inspectors. They're well acquainted with the regulations, and they're often willing to help you out.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. And moving on to our next set of questions, kind of getting away from maple a little bit, we have got multiple questions about alternative tree sap flow and productivity characteristics. So a couple questions here. One from Susan asked, I made black walnut syrup a few weeks ago, which was great. With this recent freeze warm spell, my trees were still producing sap, but it boiled down to flavored water. Is there typically only one sugar run, and how do you know when it is over? And then we also had another question from Alan that inquires, we tap about 600 birch trees in northern Canada. This year, sap was 1.1 bricks. However, this week the sap run slowed down and any sap we collected was almost pure water. We had this happen once before. Regular sap bricks resumed after a few days. This is the second time over the course of 20 years that this has happened. Have you experienced this? A couple great questions kind of on these alternative tree saps that people are tapping, such as on our walnuts and birch trees. And one thing that I'll say is that, the flow characteristics of alternative tree saps like our walnut or birch or beech trees is much different than maple. And they have not been tapped for as many years. So there's less kind of collective knowledge about these trees. And so there's a lot that we still need to learn. Some of these characteristics we have seen before of, sap sugar levels dropping. Some of those are kind of new. And so having this information from a lot of producers and sharing that with us is helpful for us to hear, as things as we continue to look into and research some of these different alternative tree saps. The walnut is especially one that's really hard to predict its sap flow process. Have you had any luck tapping walnut trees, Aaron?
I have very minimal experience tapping walnuts for sure. Read a lot about it, talked to a lot of producers, and I'll make 2 points that I think are salient here. And the first is that the importance of this, the reason why we're looking at these alternative species, I guess there are a couple of reasons. One is just purely for a unique, interesting product, potential for more profit from your land. But another is there's a lot of uncertainty in the world around maple trees, right? We've got climate change, which is impacting our ability to collect sap from these trees. It's also impacting the health of the trees in certain areas. And we've always got the uncertainty of invasive species. So there's always the possibility that some disease or insect or something could be brought in that would impact our maple trees. And having other trees, other crops we can make with the same equipment kind of minimizes the risk a little bit. So I think it's important to keep exploring these other species. The other point, though, is that we simply don't know. To your point about walnut, we just don't have a lot of experience. And it's important for our listeners to realize that sap flow, the mechanism that drives sap flow, is different in different species. So maple trees pressurize, and when you drill a hole, the sap will flow out on its own. Other trees don't have that internal pressure. Sometimes there's root pressure, which is a totally different physiological mechanism for pushing sap, but it's not as strong of an effect. Some species don't respond well to vacuum. It doesn't increase yield. So the characteristics are totally different. And with the limited number of years and experience we have tapping these other trees, there's just so much we don't know at this point. And Adam, you've been doing a lot of this work, so you've experienced that firsthand.
Yeah, it can be frustrating some years, but I think it's worthwhile. I think it's worth tapping alternative trees. I mean, we continue to tap birch trees and commercially and producing syrup and sell on top of tapping some of these other trees and experimenting with. And the last couple of years, we've been selling out of all of our birch syrup. The consumers are there. They're interested in it. It kind of goes back to our last episode. We were talking more about maple stuff, but that consumers like new, different products. And so birch syrup or walnut syrup is not something that they typically see. And the birch is oftentimes such a different tasting product that has such different culinary uses that kind of just opens up a whole new area. And so it's a great alternative to have, I think, on your shelf next to your maple sap and diversify what you can collect from your forests, and that you're not just relying on that one species. We have these other species within our woods that we can collect from. So there are some challenges, and there's still a lot to learn from some of these different tree species, but we continue to work on them and provide the information that we can get from it.
Yeah, so definitely please, link in with other people that are doing this work. Share information if you're comfortable doing that. Share with us, and we'll share what we learn. And I think collectively we'll probably figure out how to work with some of these other species and maybe develop some valuable new markets. For our final question from Anthony, who asked during the sugaring season, I am writing from Orange County, New York. My question is, what are you seeing as far as sugar content in the sap season so far? I tapped trees the first week of February and have seen an average of 1.75%. Just curious to see what others are getting. Thank you. So I included this question in the podcast. Obviously it's not relevant anymore. The sap season's over, but I included it because this is a question we get a lot. And we've been working on a new tool that might help answer this question. Right, Adam?
Yeah, exactly. We have a platform called CornellSapRun.com. It's a website where we have real-time data broadcast on there from this past maple season. We had 6 different locations from Wisconsin to Maine, up into Quebec, out into Ohio, and across New York, looking at sap flow in these different areas. And with that sap flow, we're also measuring pressure in the tree and soil moisture, soil temperature, and the air temperature, humidity, pressure, things like that in the atmosphere. So all that kind of climate data as well. And so we're collecting this data, but we're also pushing that out in real time online. So you can take a look at that and look at production in different parts of the maple production region or the maple belt. And we've also been putting sap sugar concentration data on there as well. This past year, we only had from the Arnott Forest and the Uihlein Forest, so here in New York, but 2 very different parts of New York with very different climates. So you can kind of see that sap sweetness level throughout the season. So that's a great tool. And we're continuing to do this work through the next sugaring seasons too. So that's a great reference in the future. If you're interested on, what's the sap sugar level up in Lake Placid, or what's it kind of in the Finger Lakes, or maybe we'll have sap sugar levels from different areas in the future as well that you can look on there and see, all right, this is what they're getting. How does that compare to what I'm getting in my woods? But sap sugar level does change from day to day and from year to year. And in general, this past season, we found that the sap sugar level was on average lower this year than typical, although not every producer did experience that this year. But in general, I would say it was on the lower side this year.
Yeah, there's certainly some trends that show up in this data. I would caution you against reading too much into this data. So I think generally there's not a lot we can do in the short term about sap sugar content. But it can be useful if you look at it in very specific ways. And for example, if you're seeing much lower sap sugar content in your woods compared to other producers nearby, then that might be an indication that you need to do something in your sugar bush, specifically some type of sugar bush management. Maybe you need to thin out some underperforming trees so that some other trees can thrive and have higher sap sugar content. Or perhaps you've been impacted by an insect outbreak and might want to consider having BT sprayed in your woods to control that insect outbreak the following season. So there are some very specific ways this information could be useful and used for direct application. But overall, it's somewhat academic. And really the bigger question is syrup production for tap, right? Some woods produce a lot of low sugar sap. Some produce a small amount of low sugar sap. Some produce a lot of high sugar sap. There's all kinds of variation out there. So it could just be that you have a low sugar woods with lots of red maples or something like that. But really, if you're getting the total net amount of sugar you need, you could still have good yield. And that might not be an indication of a problem if you have low sugar. So I would just, it's great to know that information. Definitely check out our website, CornellSapRun.com, but just take that information with a grain of salt. But I would say, Adam, and I'm tempted to make a maple joke here, that after these 10 questions, I'm feeling rather tapped out. And maybe our listeners, we did tap into a lot of knowledge there. So what do you say we wrap up?
I think we've hit on a lot of information here. I think we had quite a sweet time doing it. And if folks have other questions, certainly keep sending them to us. We're happy to answer questions off air through emails and through phone calls. It's fun doing these Q&A episodes as well.
All right. That sounds good, Adam. Thanks for joining me here. And thanks to our audience for joining us for another episode of Sweet Talk, All Things Maple.
Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, All Things Maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible with funding from the New York State Maple Producers Association and the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. All music is obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Have a sweet day.